July 12, 1943, 0430 hours south of Prokhorovka, a low ridge 2.5 kilometers west of the Sel River. Oberleutnant Karl Riedel of the 3rd Company, Panzergrenadier Regiment 6, leaned against the right armor plate of his Sedin KFZ, 251 half-track, and watched dust clouds form in the faint morning light. He had seen Soviet infantry attacks before, company probes, battalion waves, night infiltrations, but this was different. The ground trembled even before shapes appeared. His platoon's forward observation team reported movement stretching nearly 2 kilometers wide, and the first red glare of sunrise caught the helmets, rifles, and standards of massed Soviet guards advancing in depth. The range was still over 1,200 meters. Riedel checked his watch again. At 0431 hours, the battalion net came alive with fragmented reports. Multiple echelons, heavy armor support, density impossible to estimate. 2 minutes later, artillery behind him opened with 105 milliliters and 150 meter fire, but the smoke and dust only revealed more silhouettes behind the first ranks. Soviet 5th Guards Army had detonated smoke pots along their own line at 0400 hours, masking the final concentration. Now the haze rolled away enough that he could see dark columns, rows of men, hundreds at a time, double timing toward a single German-held corridor only 600 meters wide between 2 low-lying minefields. Riedel had studied Soviet manuals recovered during earlier operations. They encouraged breakthrough attempts by multiple divisions at once. But here, in this cramped sector, the entire weight of at least 2 Guards divisions seemed to be forcing a point he and his men had considered secure. He raised his binoculars again. At 0437 hours, he caught the unmistakable movement of T-34s and Churchill tanks from Soviet Lend-Lease stocks, lumbering behind the infantry line at irregular intervals. Their spacing suggested a deliberate doctrine: tanks to punch, infantry to pour through, more armor in reserve. Riedel's battalion, stretched thin after days of fighting, held only 1,800 meters of frontage. The corridor where the Soviet masses were converging was not even the primary axis of advance identified by German intelligence. Yet now thousands of Soviet guards, rifles slung, machine guns fixed, sappers carrying poles and explosives, advanced directly toward this narrow point as if the entire battle depended on it. At 0440 hours, Riedel muttered the first words any of his men heard him speak that morning. "This is not an attack. This is a transfer of an army through our line." The scope of what was unfolding exceeded any tactical response his company could mount. It was not simply courage, it was the concentrated weight of Soviet operational doctrine, logistics and reserves converging on a single seam. And in that moment, standing on a battered ridge at the edge of the Kursk salient, Riedel realized he was witnessing a force calibrated not for a skirmish, but for a strategic decision made hundreds of kilometers away in staff rooms filled with maps, pins, and production charts. The origins of this moment reached back to late winter 1943, when Riedel's regiment, part of the 7th Panzer Division, had been pulled from reserve positions near Kharkov to refit after months of continuous retreat. At that time, he was a recently promoted Oberleutnant with 6 years of service, including campaigns in France and the opening phases of Operation Barbarossa. By February 1943, he had already lost most of his original platoon from 1941. Replacement drafts brought 19-year-old conscripts from Bavaria and Württemberg, many arriving with only 8 weeks of training. His own experience made him one of the senior field officers in his battalion, despite his relatively junior rank. The Kursk salient formed after the Soviet winter counteroffensive stabilized. German High Command identified its protruding shape as both a threat and an opportunity. Operation Citadel, the offensive plan to eliminate the salient, underwent constant revision from March to June 1943. German intelligence estimated strong defenses, but they underestimated the density, scale, and redundancy of what the Soviets built. Riedel, assigned occasionally to assist divisional reconnaissance staff, learned in briefings that the Soviet defenses extended in up to 8 belts, totaling more than 250 kilometers in depth in some sectors. What no German officer could fully appreciate, however, was the scale of Soviet industrial mobilization behind these defenses. By mid-1943, Soviet factories, particularly those relocated east of the Urals, delivered 1,200 1,100 T-34 tanks per month. Artillery production reached 11,000 guns per quarter. Machine gun output exceeded 100,000 per quarter. On the logistical side, the Red Army fielded over 300,000 trucks, supplemented by 400,000 Lend-Lease vehicles. These numbers translated into the most important advantage at Kursk: the ability to sustain losses while maintaining operational momentum. German production, though advanced in engineering, lacked comparable scale. The Panther tank, newly introduced in 1943, offered improved firepower with its long 77.5 mm K-42 gun and thick frontal armor. But only around 200 Panthers reached the front by early July, and mechanical reliability remained uncertain. Tiger battalions, while formidable, could not be everywhere. For Panzer Grenadier units like Riedel's, defensive strength depended on 75 mm PK guns, a small number of 80 mm batteries, and the ability to move quickly to threatened sectors. But mobility meant little when facing mines, trenches, and multiple layers of Soviet artillery. In the months leading to Citadel, the Soviet High Command, Stavka, anticipated a German offensive. They constructed 400,000 anti-tank mines and 500,000 anti-personnel mines around key defensive zones. Engineer companies laid these fields in overlapping patterns, ensuring any German advance slowed to walking speed. Soviet rifle divisions dug 6,000-kilometer trenches and communication lines. Anti-tank positions were reinforced with log bunkers, steel beams, and underground command posts. When Citadel finally launched on July 5, 1943, the Germans executed simultaneous attacks from the north and south of the salient. Riedel's regiment advanced under XLV 8th Panzer Corps with the expectation of breaking through by the third day. But the advance slowed immediately. On July 5th alone, his battalion moved only 4.6 kilometers forward, far less than the planned 12-15 kilometers. Minefields forced engineers to crawl ahead at 1 to 2 meters per minute. Soviet artillery, pre-registered on mapped grid squares, responded within seconds to any concentration of German forces. By July 9th, the German offensive had consumed thousands of tons of ammunition and fuel. Their supply lines narrowed as the advance deepened. Soviet air raids struck road junctions behind the front. Meanwhile, Soviet logistics, operating along interior lines, shuttled reinforcements toward expected breakthrough points with efficiency unmatched earlier in the war. Riedel's own company was reduced by 17% in the first 4 days. Motor transport units struggled to bring forward 20-liter fuel cans through muddy tracks churned by tanks. The battalion commander reported to regimental HQ that half-tracks averaged 40-60 kilometers between minor breakdowns due to dust ingestion. Yet the southward push continued, driven by the belief that the main Soviet reserves had not yet committed. Unbeknownst to Riedel, the Soviets were concentrating those reserves in preparation not only to stop Citadel, but to reverse it. Soviet Steppe Front, commanded by General Ivan Konev, held entire armies in reserve. 5th Guards Army, 5th Guards Tank Army, 53rd Army, and supporting mechanized corps. Over 20,000 infantry from just the 32nd and 33rd Guards Rifle Divisions stood ready for rapid redeployment to threatened sectors. Stavka had allocated rail priority to formations east of Kursk, enabling divisions to shift 50 kilometers in a single night and appear in sectors where German intelligence assumed quiet conditions. This interplay, German commanders attempting to maneuver a limited but technologically superior force against Soviet commanders directing a vast, flexible, and increasingly coordinated machine, defined the days leading to Riedel's moment on July 12th. By July 10th, Riedel's regiment reached positions 15 kilometers south of Prokhorovka. The terrain consisted of rolling fields, scattered hedgerows, and narrow ravines. The Paisel River cut through the area with small bridges and fords that became vital for supply and maneuver. German aerial reconnaissance detected Soviet troop concentrations, but underestimated their depth. Reports mentioned increased rail traffic and possible reserve commitment, but lacked specifics. On July 11th, orders arrived. Hold a newly secured ridgeline and prepare for renewed advance. The battalion's frontage exceeded doctrinal recommendations by nearly 40% due to attrition. Ammunition resupply consisted of 7.92mm rifle cartridges, hand grenades, and 75mm shells, though 80mm ammunition arrived late due to a damaged bridge. Fuel remained tight. That evening, Soviet artillery increased in tempo. Starting at 2200 hours, 70 Sipida-6, 122mm, and 120mm guns fired harassing barrages every 30 minutes. Soviet searchlights illuminated the low clouds. Intercepted radio messages suggested major formations, repositioning opposite Riedel's regiment. Still, no one expected what came next. At 0330 hours, July 12th, the first sappers cut lane markers into their own forward minefields to guide the assault echelons. At 0410 hours, Soviet commanders issued the order to advance. And by 0430 hours, as the first full rays of daylight spread across the steppe, Oberleutnant Karl Riedel saw thousands of Guards riflemen emerging from the morning mist in organized waves, converging on the narrowest seam in the German line, when his battalion had covered with only 2 infantry companies, a depleted heavy weapons platoon, and a pair of 75mm anti-tank guns. The sheer scale, 20,000 Guards converging through one break, represented not only an overwhelming numerical challenge, but the culmination of Soviet operational planning designed to absorb German blows and exploit the first weakening seam. And, as he watched that force approach, Riedel understood how days of attrition, delayed supplies, underestimated reserves, and systemic Soviet preparation had shaped the battlefield that now unfolded before him. At 0442 hours, German artillery observers across the ridge attempted to adjust their fire, but Soviet counter-battery units were already tracking muzzle flashes from behind tree lines and reverse slopes. Within 3 minutes, 122 mm howitzers bracketed the German positions, landing shells that walked methodically across trenches and communication dugouts. Oberleutnant Karl Riedel crouched beside the right fender of his half-track as shrapnel tore through the upper branches of a nearby birch. His platoon sergeant, Feldwebel Brunner, shouted updates. First wave at 800 meters, second wave forming behind them, armor support still masked by dust but closing steadily. The battalion's single-functioning 80mm gun, deployed 300 meters behind Riedel's line, requested immediate fire authorization. Reports from the left flank indicated that Soviet sappers were already attempting to cut through wire obstacles at 600 meters. At 0445 hours, the battalion commander broadcast the order to open concentrated small arms fire. MG-34 teams along the ridge began firing in sustained 150 round bursts, stitching the open ground with tracers. Rifle grenadiers tried to disrupt Soviet squad leaders by targeting effectives who carried radios or flags. For a brief moment, the fire forced the nearest Soviet ranks to drop and crawl. But the depth of the formations made suppression impossible. When one line scattered, another advanced behind it at a steady pace. By 0450 hours, the first elements of the 32nd Guards Rifle Division, supported by attached anti-tank rifle platoons, reached 500 meters. The corridor they were pushing through, only a few hundred meters of relatively open ground between two dense mine belts, compressed the assault into a massive column. Riedel recognized the danger immediately. If they broke through even a single point, the entire frontage could collapse under the weight of numbers, rendering flanking fire ineffective. He ordered his remaining two half-tracks forward by 20 meters to create staggered firing positions. Company runners delivered ammunition crates under covering fire, dragging 7.92mm belts and 75mm shells in canvas sacks through shallow depressions. At 0453 hours, a sudden metallic crack split the air. The 80mm gun finally opened fire. Its first round struck a distant T-34 at 100 meters, penetrating the glacis and sending a column of smoke straight upward. A second shot hit a Churchill tank at 1,250 meters, disabling its left track. Soviet infantry flowed around the immobilized tank, not breaking formation. Riedel noted the discipline. The assault would not stall. The Soviets were accepting tank losses to keep the advance moving. By 0500 hours, German machine guns overheated. Crews swapped barrels while assistant gunners continued feeding ammunition. The Scratch Heavy Weapons Platoon deployed its two remaining 81mm mortars, firing at maximum rate, 15 to 18 rounds per minute, onto the Soviet approach lanes. The bombardment momentarily slowed the second and third Soviet echelons, but the volume of men was overwhelming. To Riedel's right, a platoon reported that Soviet scouts had identified a shallow gully leading into the corridor, providing partial cover. The Soviets began redirecting squads into that feature, further narrowing the distance. Then, at 0507 hours, the decisive shift began. Soviet commanders unleashed their supporting armor. From the far edge of the dust cloud, at least 60 T-34s emerged in loose lines, advancing at 12-16 km/h. Behind them, two regiments of self-propelled guns, Su-76 and Su-122s, fired over open sights on German positions. Their advance meant that infantry would no longer absorb the first wave of losses. Instead, they became the mass behind the armor, ready to exploit any breach. Riedel's battalion, already stretched thin, faced a dilemma: hold fire for anti-tank guns or continue suppressing infantry. Ammunition expenditure reports showed that frontline squads had consumed 45% of their rifle cartridges in the first half hour. Mortar ammunition was down to 30 rounds per tube. Worse, the 80mm gun, their best asset, came under heavy Soviet artillery fire. At 0512 hours, a direct hit silenced it, killing half the crew and damaging the carriage. German Luftwaffe support remained absent. Morning fog at rear airfields delayed the launch of dive bombers assigned to Expedilate Panzer Corps. Without air power, German units relied solely on ground weapons to blunt the assault. Meanwhile, Soviet air regiments from the 2nd Air Army flew Il-2 Sturmovik sorties as early as 500 hours. Their pilots, flying low at 200-300 meters, strafed German positions with 20mm cannon fire and RS-82 rockets. Riedel's men fired back with rifles and the few functioning MG-42s, but the low passes disrupted command posts and killed several radio operators. Communications began breaking down, replaced by runner traffic that took 8 to 12 minutes to traverse even short distances across the ridge. At 0520 hours, the 1st Soviet infantry platoons reached the outer wire. Sappers carrying long bamboo poles and explosive satchel charges moved forward under covering fire. The terrain advantage disappeared quickly once the Soviets crossed the last 200 meters. Riedel watched as one sapper team placed 2 charges against the wire fence. The explosion tore a 2-meter gap in the barrier. 5 more teams moved in to widen it. With the corridor now fully aligned with their movement, Soviet infantry surged forward, filling the breach before German machine guns could remount their positions after being forced down by Sturmovik attacks. At 05:28 hours, Soviet tanks reached effective firing range. A T-34 fired a high explosive shell that struck a forward trench, collapsing a section and killing 6 grenadiers instantly. Another tank shelled a half-track parked near the second line of defense, sending burning fuel spraying across the dry grass. The Germans responded with 75mm PK guns, firing armor-piercing rounds at ranges under 600 meters. The first PK crew destroyed 2 T-34s in rapid succession before a return shell killed the gunner. The second PK gun jammed after its 4th shot due to a damaged breech block. At 05:35 hours, the battalion commander ordered a fallback to the reverse slope of the ridge. But for Riedel, the withdrawal moment came too late. Soviet infantry had already penetrated 60-70 meters into the German forward line at the center of the corridor. Close combat erupted among shell holes and collapsed trenches. Grenades exploded at 10 to 20-meter intervals. Rifle fire gave way to bayonets and machine pistol bursts. The weight of the Soviet advance forced Riedel to divide his remaining men into ad hoc assault groups, each defending small clusters of terrain no more than a few dozen meters wide. By 05:45 hours, the breach widened rapidly. Soviet commanders funneled more infantry, hundreds at a time, through the gap. The breakthrough zone expanded from 60 meters wide to almost 150 meters. German flanking fire failed to close it. Riedel realized the Soviet plan: create enough space for armored units to pass through. Once tanks cleared the breach, the battle would shift decisively in favor of the Soviets. At 05:50 hours, the first wave of Soviet tanks pushed through the opening. Dust clouds thickened as tracks tore through soft soil and crushed collapsed wire entanglements. They advanced in staggered lines, aiming to bypass German strongpoints rather than engage directly. Riedel's company medic reported that casualty stations behind the ridge already overflowed with wounded, most suffering shrapnel injuries from artillery and airstrikes. The battalion reserve platoon, held 400 meters to the rear, received orders at 05:53 hours to counterattack immediately. But as they moved forward, Soviet artillery shifted fire onto their approach route, pinning them down. By 0600 hours, the situation reached critical mass. Riedel's sector had lost nearly half its machine guns. Ammunition supply ran dangerously low. The company's remaining half-track, loaded with belted ammunition, attempted to drive forward. But at 06:03 hours, it was hit by an anti-tank round that disabled its engine. Flames erupted from the hood. The driver and assistant driver died instantly. At 06:07 hours, Soviet officers began signaling the next phase: exploitation. Having punched a hole through the German line, they now funneled entire battalions of guards riflemen through the breach, moving them at nearly jogging speed. Riedel watched in disbelief as what looked like a continuous river of men, rows of 40 or 50 abreast, stretching hundreds deep, poured through the same point. The total number easily exceeded a division's worth of manpower. Based on the density and speed, he estimated upward of 20,000 troops were converging through the breach over a 60-90-minute window. No tactical reserve his battalion possessed could stop such a mass. At 06:15 hours, new Soviet self-propelled guns emerged behind the infantry stream. These units fired on German strongpoints from the flanks, using the widened corridor to maneuver. German companies on either side attempted to reorient their lines to form a horseshoe around the breach, but they lacked numbers and anti-tank capability. Requests for panzer support went unanswered. The nearest armored elements were engaged several kilometers south against fresh Soviet tank brigades. At 06:20 hours, Riedel's position became untenable. Soviet infantry infiltrated around his command vehicle. Hand grenades exploded against the hull of the half-track. He ordered his surviving men to withdraw on foot toward a fallback trench 300 meters to the rear. The retreat took place under intense rifle and machine gun fire. Many grenadiers fell as they crossed open ground. Riedel himself was knocked down by the concussion of a mortar round that landed 5 meters behind him. Dust filled his lungs as he scrambled toward a shallow ditch, clutching his map case. At 06:28 hours, German artillery attempted a final defensive barrage, firing 150mm rounds into the corridor. Several shells hit concentrations of Soviet infantry, buying a few minutes of breathing room. But the Soviet formations were too deep. Losses in the first ranks had no effect on the massive flow still entering the breach. Supply columns followed. Behind, bringing ammunition crates, medical teams, and anti-aircraft units on trucks and tractors. By 06:35 hours, Soviet armored spearheads began moving laterally behind the German front, aiming to envelop ridge positions from the west. This confirmed what Riedel dreaded. The breach had become a highway for Soviet exploitation forces. German doctrine emphasized sealing breaches quickly with counterattacks, but here the speed and density of Soviet reserves created a breakthrough that expanded faster than German maneuver units could respond. The battle no longer resembled a contested front. It had become a penetration operation with operational depth. At 0640 hours, Riedel reached his battalion's fallback line. The battalion commander, his uniform covered in dust and blood, surveyed the situation with a distant stare. Radio intercepts confirmed Soviet formations, advancing at least 2 kilometers through the gap. Reports from adjacent regiments described similar pressure. The battalion's strength had fallen below 45%. Ammunition for heavy weapons had nearly run out. The commander issued withdrawal orders toward a secondary position along the next ridge. The voice on the battalion net sounded flat. The sector is compromised. Execute phased retreat. At 0650 hours, Riedel looked back over the ridge and saw the full weight of Soviet manpower spilling across the battlefield. The corridor now spanned nearly 300 meters. Tanks, infantry, artillery teams, and supply vehicles all moved through it. The system had worked. Soviet commanders had identified the weakest seam, concentrated overwhelming force, and delivered tens of thousands of troops into the German rear within a single hour. For Riedel, the realization crystallized. The attack was not merely a tactical success, but the result of a fully integrated operational plan involving logistics on a scale the German army could no longer match. Soviet production had ensured reserves deep enough to replace casualties instantly. Soviet rail networks delivered divisions exactly where needed. Their artillery had neutralized German strongpoints. Their air power, though not always dominant, arrived earlier and in greater numbers. Everything aligned into a machine that could punch through any sector given enough preparation. By 0700 hours, Soviet forces established a forward command post inside the captured breach. Their engineers marked new lanes for supply flow. Anti-tank guns dug into shallow pits facing potential German counterattacks. Forward observers called in fresh artillery strikes on German fallback positions. The momentum had decisively shifted. At 0715 hours, Riedel's battalion began its retreat toward the P-cell crossings. A few damaged vehicles attempted to limp along, engines coughing black smoke. Walking wounded supported each other across open fields. Soviet shells continued landing behind them, sending dirt plumes into the air. The battle that morning would later be overshadowed by larger tank clashes near Prokhorovka, but for Riedel and his men, the moment they witnessed, 20,000 Soviet guards flooding through one breach in the German line, symbolized a turning point far greater than a single day of fighting. It marked the moment when German officers realized that courage, training, and tactical excellence could no longer compensate for strategic and industrial realities. The Soviet Union had built a war machine capable of generating offensive power on a scale the Wehrmacht could not contain. In the weeks that followed, the Soviet counteroffensive rolled forward. Operation Citadel collapsed. The Germans withdrew from the Oral salient and then Kharkov. Steppe Front and Voronezh Front advanced relentlessly, driving the Germans back toward the Dnieper. The breach near Prokhorovka became one among many points where Soviet momentum broke the spine of German operational planning. The lesson was unmistakable. Courage could hold a trench for minutes. Systems could move armies for miles. At Kursk, German commanders watched those systems in action. Railways feeding divisions, factories supplying tanks, artillery coordinating across kilometers, infantry formations flowing like rivers through engineered breaches. The war's trajectory shifted firmly in the Soviet favor. Thank you for watching this World War II story. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.